The following is a conversation between myself and Bernardo Kastrup. He's a philosopher, the executive director of the Essentia Foundation, which you can find on YouTube. He's most well known to a broader audience as a philosopher, dual PhDs, one in computer engineering, one in philosophy. He's a prolific philosophical author. About a dozen books, is it, Bernardo?
10.
10 books. I've read 3 of them. More Than Allegory, which is kind of a layperson's take on things. The Idea of the World, which is a bit more sophisticated in approach, a kind of academic approach at these ideas. And also a book, Why Materialism is Baloney, which I enjoy. That was my most recent read. He's here today to talk with me about analytical idealism. And I hope that I've generated some questions here that you haven't fielded a million times. But before we get started here, why don't you just give us a little bit about your background for people that aren't familiar with you and how you came to be interested in philosophical ideas?
I think I was born interested in philosophical ideas. I remember being a kid and thinking about what I would later understand to be philosophical questions very spontaneously. So I have always been a philosopher. I think being a philosopher is part of being human, although some of us don't quite realize or pay attention to it. Originally, I went to computer engineering school. I was 17. I was very much into computers. I wanted to build my own. So I studied computer engineering, artificial intelligence, reconfigurable computing, got a PhD in those topics. And then at some point in my late 20s, I was thinking about AI, how to have a piece of silicon behave like a human brain in the sense of processing information in the same way with the same results. And of course, the question immediately pops in your mind, well, if I can do this to make it intelligent, what do I need to add to make it conscious? In other words, that it doesn't only process data, but the data processing is accompanied by experience, like the data processing in my own mind. And that question set me squarely back on philosophy. I realized that that question would have no answer if I started from materialist premises, which showed to me that there was something wrong in my premises. And eventually got a second PhD in philosophy, wrote a bunch of books and papers, and I've been talking about it ever since.
You know, when I read books, Bernardo, what has troubled me as someone who's trying to understand the truth, when it comes to these books on materialism and idealism, I can see what look like good points being made, but it can kind of seem clustered for me, and it's just hard for me to make sense of everything. So I'd really like to stick to facts. I'd like a list of 10 facts that show that idealism is a more logically coherent worldview than materialism or some other ism. So we'll try to stick to facts here, but before we get into physics, why don't you just give us a little bit of background about what analytical idealism is?
It's the idea that reality is fundamentally mental, of a mental nature, which doesn't mean that it's in your mind alone or in my mind alone or only in the minds of living beings. It only says that the, quote, substance of reality is mentality or mentation as a category, not as an instance. In other words, I'm not saying that the world is made of wooden tables. I'm saying that it's made of wood. Now replace wood with consciousness and you get what I mean. Your consciousness is like a wooden table. It's an instance of consciousness. Mine is another instance of consciousness. I'm not saying that the universe is made of these two instances or a whole bunch of instances. I'm only saying that it's made of consciousness. It's made of wood, and we are just a small part of it. And we try to articulate the logical and mainstream empirical reasons why this is a much more plausible hypothesis than mainstream physicalism, which is the idea that all there is physicality.
So when it comes to facts, I think most people that are interested in these ideas, whether professionally or as a layperson, we really like physics. Many physicists would say it all comes down to physics, chemistry, and biology, and psychology. It's all just physics. Why, in your mind, does analytical idealism make a better sense of physics than something like materialism?
Because physics, like any science, is not about what nature is. It's about how nature behaves and how we can predict that behavior in the interest of creating technology. A scientific theory is correct or not on the basis of whether it makes correct or erroneous predictions about what nature will do next. So we run an experiment, we check out how nature actually behaves, and we compare that to the theory. So science is about behavior, not about being, not about essence. Physics is a science, so it's not about what nature is. It's about what nature, how nature behaves, insofar as we can discern through perception. Even if we use instruments like telescopes, microscopes, oscilloscopes, we still have to perceive the output of that instrument. So physics is the science of how nature on the screen of perception behaves over time. Philosophy comes in informed by physics, trying to make educated guesses about what nature is in and of itself. If a physicist says the world is fundamentally physical in essence, he's making a philosophical pronouncement, not a scientific pronouncement. Even if he's not aware of this difference, that's what actually is going on. So I would say that given the latest results from physics regarding how nature behaves, the idea that physicality has standalone reality has been refuted. All the properties that we associate with physicality or materiality, such as mass, charge, spin, momentum, whatever, these are now proven experimentally in a way that has been repeated by multiple groups over 40 years with increasing sophistication. These physical properties are a result of measurement. They didn't exist prior to measurement, which shows that what we call the physical world is not the bottom layer of reality. It is not the foundation. It is the appearance of something else. And of course, appearances, you can only speak of appearances if something is observed, because then it appears. Prior to observation, there is no appearance, there is only the world as it is in itself. And that world we now know, short of one question, we now know it's not physical. It cannot be physical. And idealism comes in and says, well, it's mental, and physicality is just the appearance of mentality from certain points of view. Now, arguably, the only way to evade this conclusion is to postulate that there are gazillions of real physical universes popping into existence every infinitesimal fraction of a femtosecond, for which we have exactly zero evidence. So what's more plausible? That's the question. I have an answer to this question myself.
Let's go back into that idea of the many worlds thing and quantum decoherence. But before we do that, can you tell us just a little bit about the whole dashboard idea that you have? I thought that was really good in your Essentia course that you do on analytical idealism. And I'll put the link for that course down in the description for anyone that wants to go further into these ideas. But talk a little bit about the dashboard, because that's going to be kind of a prerequisite to some of these questions that I have.
Yeah, one of the foundations of physicalism is the naive notion that our perception is like a transparent window into the world. That is, the shapes and forms and contours that we discern when we look at the world are the forms of the world as it is in itself, or as it was before we looked at it. So this is a very naive and now proven wrong assumption. We cannot perceive the world as it truly is, because if we had the perceptual apparatus that would allow us to see the world through a kind of transparent window, we would have no upper bound in the dispersion of our inner perceptual states, because there is no upper bound to the dispersion of the states of the world. So if we were to mirror that dispersion, that diversion, that variety, that diversity, if we were to mirror the diversity of states of the world inside ourselves through perception, there would be no guarantee that we wouldn't melt into some kind of warm soup. Because we couldn't then resist the second law of thermodynamics. So this is a sophisticated technical way to say the following. If perception were a transparent window, simply by looking at the world, we would run the risk of dying, because the dispersion of the world would be reflected in the dispersion of our inner states, and we wouldn't be able to maintain our structural integrity if all that dispersion were mirrored inside. So this is a mathematical argument that has been made in the last 8 years, I think. There is a similar argument from evolutionary theory that evolution would drive true perception swiftly to extinction. There is just too much information in the world, presumably, for us to apprehend all that through perception. We need a sort of interface, a simplifying interface. Professor Donald Hoffman compares that to the desktop metaphor of a computer. A little file on the desktop is like a rectangle, a colored rectangle. But the file, as it really is a pattern of millions of open and closed microscopic silicon switches. If we were to see the file for what it really is, we wouldn't be able to work with a computer. So we get a sort of a representation thereof that allows us to use the computer. In the same way, nature or evolution would never have constructed sense organs that gave us a sort of a view of what is really out there. It would be too confusing. We would be driven to extinction. What we have is a sort of a virtual reality headset. So the idea behind all this is that what we call the physical world or materiality is not the thing in itself. It's an image thereof, a representation thereof. It's the way the world as it is in itself appears or presents itself to the screen of perception. But matter is not the ultimate reality by definition, because it's an appearance of something else that then, again, by definition, is non-material. Because if you call matter the representation, then the thing represented is by definition not material. It doesn't have any of the properties that we usually associate with matter or physicality.
You know, when I read Donald Hoffman's book, The Case Against Reality, I was kind of disgruntled with it because at some point in the book, he kind of bases everything on some computer simulations that he ran with some graduate students. And he doesn't really go into that at all. But what you're saying here is the reason that we don't see reality the way that it is because it would just be an abundance of information. It would be too sophisticated for us to process in any meaningful way. Is that right?
Sort of. Technically, it's not quite right. Technically, the argument, there are two lines of argument that are completely different, but they converge to the same conclusion. One is an evolutionary theory perspective. The other one is a thermodynamics perspective. The thermodynamics perspective, to be accurate, it says the following. We cannot assume that there is a natural limit to the dispersion of what's going on outside in the world. That assumption would be gratuitous, unjustifiable. So we cannot assume this upper limit. So the world outside has no upper limit in how diverse it can be. If we were then to mirror the world in our perception, in other words, if we were to see the world for what it actually is by mirroring it in our internal cognitive representations, then our internal states would not have any upper bound on dispersion either, because they are mirroring a world that has no upper bound. And if that were the case, perceiving would be literally very deadly business. It's like Perseus looking at the Gorgon and turning into stone. He has to fight the Gorgon not by looking at it, but by acquiring indirect information about where the Gorgon is, what it's doing. Medusa, the Gorgon.
Yeah.
So in a sense, that metaphor is applicable here. If we were to see reality for what it actually is, for all we know, we would just dissolve into a highly entropic warm soup, because we couldn't maintain our structural integrity if we were to mirror what's outside. So that's one argument. And Donald's argument is extremely simple. He's just saying truth is not conducive to survival. Evolution favors survival, not truth. Why would we think that these two things are the same? Obviously, they are not.
So I know that it can be kind of difficult to work with these kind of ideas if you're brought up in a scientific kind of physicalist environment. You know, there are a lot of scientists out there that are a lot smarter than I am that just reject these kinds of ideas. And I understand to some sense that they're kind of raised in to believe that, but I'm just curious what you think about why someone that's such a competent individual would scoff at these ideas when, from my layperson's perspective, it actually seems to be following logically.
We are all humans, and we are all psychological beings, so to say. We have our psychological quirks, strengths, and weaknesses. If you look back into the history of science, this happens all the time. A few examples. When Newton put forward that it was an invisible force called gravity that held the celestial bodies together by exerting attraction at a distance without contact. The French laughed for 10 years at Newton's ideas because
Yeah.
it was completely absurd to them. At that moment, in the early Enlightenment or late Renaissance, early Enlightenment would be more accurate, the idea that influences could be transmitted without touch was absurd. Newton's gravity was magical woo woo. An invisible force acting
Yeah.
instantly at a distance. What the hell is that? It took the French 50 years to stop laughing. Um, and then suddenly in the 19th century, Newton was God. You wouldn't make progress in science by contradicting Newton. Some people started doing that late in the 19th century. And then guess what? Then came around Einstein, who was ridiculed when he said that gravity is a curvature of
Yeah.
space-time. And people were like, only things can be curved. Space-time is not a thing. It's
Right.
the empty pot where you put things. But now we know that Einstein was right and Newton was wrong. There was a time in science when we thought that I forgot the name, that electrostatic attraction between chaff and a rod of amber was caused because there was an invisible elastic substance that connected the shaft to the amber. So if you try to pull the shaft away from the amber, that elastic substance would stretch and pull the shaft back.
Yeah.
And this was a highly reasonable scientific idea to explain the phenomenon of electrostatic attraction. Never mind, it didn't make sense of electrostatic repulsion, but
Yeah.
attraction was well accounted in terms of this invisible thing. Today we laugh at it. Why? Because today we have other invisible things. We have quantum fields. We have elementary subatomic particles that can never be measured directly. We have never measured the Higgs boson directly. It decays before it can be measured. What we measure is a footprint that we can theoretically reconstruct and say there was a Higgs boson there. Oh, there is always invisible things we appeal to,
Yeah.
magical things we appeal to, but the fashion changes over time. So if today I say it's all consciousness, which is the most concrete thing you can think of, it's all you have, everything else is a theory, because we are so used to these abstract, invisible theoretical entities, it is the concrete that is now taboo. You are better off talking about completely abstract quantum fields that only exist in the form of equations on a computer or on paper. That's more plausible than to say consciousness underlies everything, because the latter sounds too much like New Age. So you see, we always operate in terms of fashions, prejudices, because we are psychological beings. It's not surprising. It's nothing to be angry about. It's just how it is.
Yeah. I actually read not the most famous biography on Einstein, but I read this one, Einstein, A Life. And it was talking about Einstein and his ideas when he was proposing them, that some of the physicists of the time actually thought that he was mentally ill with his ideas. It was so I think that's a great analogy with Newton and everything.
And Einstein did the same to the quantum physicists. He thought the quantum physicists were bonkers, that their
Yeah.
theory had to
Right.
be incomplete. But very
He even thought
recently,
his own theory was bonkers with black holes and whatnot. But let me ask you this, because to go back to something that you said when you were going through computer engineering school, you had a hard time imagining how silicon could produce experience. Is it possible, perhaps in principle, that a human constructed altar, not necessarily made of silicone, could be manufactured in such a way as to harness a dissociated perspective of mind at large?
well, don't we do that? That's what we are doing all the time. We are harnessing a dissociative perspective of mind at large. But just by looking at the world, what we perceive is how the world looks like from across the dissociative boundaries, because
Yeah.
we are dissociated alters, in my view. So that's what we are doing. Can we artificially create an altar? I
Yes.
think we can. I think abiogenesis, there will be something we will achieve at some point. In other words, creating life from non-life. I think life is what dissociated alters look like: biology, metabolism. So to create an alter, we would have to create life from scratch, not using already pre-existing life. To try to do that through silicon is like completely ignoring the substrate. It's sort of marrying yourself to abstraction and forgetting the reality of the matter. But I think alters through abiogenesis will be something we will succeed in achieving at some point. And then that alter will exploit a dissociated perspective of mind at large, just like we do. That's what we are doing at all times. What else are we doing?
When it comes to physics, if the world is mental, physics seems to work well. So I'm curious what you think about something like free will. Is this system somewhat deterministic, or is it some kind of libertarian situation? How do you feel about free will in an analytical idealism kind of worldview?
I think libertarian free will is an incoherent concept. It has no meaning. It can be reduced to randomness, but that's not what people mean by free will. So the concept, I think, is incoherent. It's a very difficult topic. To some extent, it's a red herring. So let me try to do justice to my own view here in a short time. The reason usually put forward to deny free will, I think, is completely fallacious. And the reason that is usually put forward is that the experience of a choice is by definition experiential.
Yeah.
But that experience is generated by something that is not experiential. In other words, by brain function. And brain function is not an experience. It's just a thing. It's just a process that generates all experience, including the experience that we think that we made a choice. I think that reason to reject to reject free will is false, because I don't think the brain is outside experience. I think the brain is the image of a particular configuration of experience. So I reject that reason to discard free will. And then you could say, well, then I endorse free will insofar as I define free will as whatever is left on the table if I reject physicalism as a reason to deny free will. But that would be unfair as well, because I am not. I don't think libertarian free will is coherent. So what do I mean by free will? Well, my intuition about free will is that if I make a choice, I have been free to make the choice if the choice has been made by that which I identify myself with, as opposed to external forces. So if I choose to go to work because market and economic forces outside me force me to work, as opposed to being at home watching Euro 2020, the football competition, then I didn't have free will making the choice to work. That choice was imposed on me. But it out of my preferences, my character, my proclivities, my memories, my tastes, I make a choice. Then that's a free-willed choice, even though it has been determined, but determined by me, not by external forces. You see what I mean? So I think mind at large, because it's all there is, universal consciousness, it's all there is, and it is mental, then by definition it has free will, because whatever choices it makes are determined by itself. There is nothing outside of itself. But do we as alters have a lot of free will? I don't think so. I think a lot of our choices are determined by impersonal forces that sort of flow underneath our metacognitive consciousness. Things that we are not even explicitly aware of about ourselves. We choose the persons the people we marry with, largely based on projections, which we are not metacognitively aware of, and therefore we don't identify with. We choose our professions sometimes because of market forces, but sometimes because of preferences that we don't understand about ourselves. So as alters, I think we have very little free will. Our choices are determined by transpersonal forces. But as universal consciousness, which is what we ultimately are, then we have total free will, because all choices are determined by it, since there is nothing else. This whole thing depends on what we identify ourselves with. There are states of mind, of consciousness, in which people succeed or end up identifying themselves with the whole of existence. These are ephemeral states. They don't last very long. They are very difficult to get to, but they are very compelling when you are there. They are self-evident. It becomes clear to yourself that this is what is true. This is what has been going on at all times. And then you have total free will, even as a person, because although you're still dissociated, you identify with the whole of the universe. So whatever happens, it has been your choice. Whatever happens, even if you get sick, it has been your choice. And there are states of mind in which you really cognize things this way. You really realize that you are choosing the whole thing, not as a person, but as the core subjectivity that underlies you and the rest of nature. And people, when they come back from these states, sometimes they make the mistake of thinking that it is them as people that were choosing everything. And they go around and they say they are God, which is, of course, false. But I can understand where the mistake happened and where it came from.
If we are all dissociated perspectives of the one mind at large, in some sense, wouldn't that mean that we are God, or am I just way off the mark with that?
It depends on what you mean by the word God. There is a sense in which, yes, that would be correct to say. There are gazillion senses, probably 7.5 billion senses, in which this would be incorrect. For instance, if your idea of God is an old man with a beard sitting on a cloud up in the sky and taking personal interest in the dealings of humanity and demanding prayer and sacrifice and issuing judgment and punishment, then no, I don't think we are that at all. Even if you think of God as a metacognitive being, in other words, a being capable of explicit deliberation, of self-reflection, of planning, I don't think then that we are God. I don't think universal consciousness is capable of metacognition. But if you say, well, we are all one omniscient mind, then yes, then we are all God in that sense. Yeah.
That's what I would be thinking. If I am, if I originate from the one mind, then that would be my conception of God, because I'm not a big fan of religions like Christianity and whatnot. But one thing I really like about you, and I think one of the reasons why you had credibility with me and I continued on reading your books, is because you're coming at all of this from like a scientific kind of perspective, with none of the religious stuff that oftentimes comes along with these ideas. But, I really appreciate the fact that you're using science to explain what's going on in psychology, which is probably loosely science. But let me ask you this, because it's a question that I have here. Is there any kind of religion that can be made out of this thing, or is that just not a good idea?
I wouldn't make a religion out of it, because, as you correctly said, I come at it from a pretty analytical perspective, an empirical and analytical perspective. And that's not what religion is. Religion arises from direct insight, from direct experience. The origin of every single religious system in history, there has been a direct experience of transcendence. So I'm using the other two alternative paths to knowledge, and explicitly not direct experience. So I don't think what I'm putting forward is suited to create any religion. I wouldn't be personally very happy if somebody tried to do that. But I would say this: I think
Bernardo Kastrup cult.
Oh man, if I'm dead and this happens, I think I'll twist on my grave, because that would represent, the ultimate misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what I was all about. But I would say this. And this is not a surprise to me. The conclusions I think we arrive at under an analytic idealist framework are very consistent with the essence behind most of the world's religions, what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy. In other words, once you cut through all the metaphor, all the judging, all the specific details, and you get to the core of a religion, that core tends to be the same across multiple religions. I mean, it's well known that Christianity and Buddhism share a core to a surprising extent. That core, that perennial philosophy, is consistent with what I'm putting forward. And I don't think that is surprising, because, something is true. We may not know what it is, but something is true, and we are bang in the middle of it. We are living in what is truth. What is true? Whether we understand it or not, we are banging in the middle of that. So we are bound to eventually, across cultures and across time, to stumble upon a realization of the truth. The truth is not fragile. Even if we are deluded about it for 300 years, the truth is still true, regardless of what we think of it. And we are still banging in the middle of it. So it's not a surprise to me that this consistency is there, but I certainly wouldn't use my approach to create a new religion. That's not what it's all about. No.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that fact. I want to go back and catch something that you talked about. You talked about enlightening experiences. I'm curious, before we talk about the process of dissociation here, to open up some more of these questions, can mind at large be accessed by means other than meditation or drugs, or how do you feel about that kind of thing?
Well, I think it can. I mean, I think, look,
because many people would say that that's just obvious that you could do it with meditation, and then some people would say that it's certain that you can do it with drugs. But I'm also curious what you think about other potential ways to reach out to mind at large.
Look, personally, I am very hard-headed. I have a very analytic, focused mind. So I can't do that with meditation alone. Meditation has helped, but there were drugs in the mix. And I personally am not capable of doing that on the natch. I see that people are very different. So I can clearly see that some people can do that not only on the natch, but when they're not trying to. It happens spontaneously to them. I mean, this is the birth of religion, when it happens spontaneously with someone. They see the truth and then they come back, they misinterpret the whole thing, creates all kinds of stories around it and found a religion. But this is my personal limitation. Theoretically, anything that weakens the dissociative process, whose image is biology, whose image is metabolism, anything that sort of disrupts and weakens that process of dissociation is, at least in principle, capable of giving us a perspective across the dissociative boundary without using our senses only. And you see that people have tried to do that. For instance, a lot of initiatory rituals in pre-literate cultures are centered around physical exertion, poisoning, dehydration through 3 days in a sweat lodge, things that really punish your metabolism into dysfunction. Now, of course, you will impair much more than only the dissociative process. You will impair metabolic processes that have nothing to do with the dissociation itself in any direct sense. But you end up impairing the dissociation too. And I think that's why these pre-literate cultures, they see these initiatory rituals as essential for a young person to finally gain a perspective of what is real. It's according to them, it unveils mysteries that couldn't be unveiled through words and stories alone. And I think that's what they are doing inadvertently. They are punishing their physiology to an extreme degree, because it has the side effect of weakening the dissociation and leading to insights that otherwise couldn't be had.
Before we talk about dissociative identity disorder, which is perhaps the most extreme mental illness, it's a very interesting thing to read on, even as a non-expert. But when it comes to Tom Campbell, I know you've heard of him, not real familiar with him, but he thinks that maybe something similar in some way to what Donald Hoffman thinks, that this is a virtual reality. And I think that a lot of your guys' ideas are very similar. And I'm just curious because I'm sure you've thought about it. What do you think? Could this be a virtual reality, or is that some kind of pseudoscientific nonsense?
No, it's a metaphor. The danger of metaphors is that if you use only one, it can be interpreted literally, and you start deriving the implications of the metaphor as opposed to that which the thing is a metaphor of, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You lose sight that what you're doing is creating a metaphor, and you start deriving the implications of the metaphor. That is the danger, and that's why you always see me using multiple metaphors. Because my hope is that people realize that what I'm trying to say is what is common across the metaphors and not the metaphors themselves. There is a sense in which the virtual reality headset metaphor is useful. We talked earlier in this conversation about the physical world being merely an appearance of a deeper level of reality. The physical world is what the world as it is in itself is how it presents itself to us. It's not what it is in and of itself. In that sense, you could say the physical world is a kind of virtual reality. It's an appearance. It's not the thing it's an appearance of. It's just the appearance. But you can take the metaphor too far. And you say, well, if it's a virtual reality, it's a kind of simulation. Therefore, we exist in the computer of a more advanced species. Well, now you're confusing the metaphor with the thing in itself. You have to stay within the limits in which the metaphor is useful. Simulation theory presupposes all kinds of other things, like there has to be a more advanced species.
Yeah.
That species has to have built some kind of a computer. And that computer has to somehow be able to generate consciousness, which faces the hard problem of consciousness. So you get into all kinds of problems that do not actually exist if you kept in mind that you're dealing with a metaphor. Because those problems are the implications of the metaphor, not the thing that you are trying to explain with the metaphor. So I'm very cautious about going to simulation theory metaphors and virtual realities. And when I do that, I mix it with other metaphors, like the dashboard metaphor that we talked about earlier. So to not give people a chance to sort of go too far down the line of the metaphor.
So there are just too many assumptions involved to get that far then.
If you take the metaphor for the thing
Literally.
in itself, then you start deriving all kinds of implications from the metaphor and making all kinds of assumptions around the metaphor that have no place in the original thing you're trying to explain.
I just want to read one sentence from Tom Campbell that kind of, I felt it jived with what you think is right. We are all here for a purpose. And physical reality is a virtual reality based on consciousness of which we are individuated units, which I saw a commonality there, even though maybe he, in your mind, goes a step too far with the virtual. He even says things like the speed of light is a constant because that's the fastest progress you can make across pixelated units of space-time. And I don't want to argue his perspective for him because I don't know it, but I don't know. I'd really like to see you two have a conversation, and I'm going to work on that. But let's talk about special relativity before we go on here. It's the final physics question. In special relativity, we have a concept, relativity of simultaneity, where two different observers, you and I, can see one physical event happen differently. It's kind of this mind-blowing thing, and I'm not even sure if I've wrapped my mind around it, but I'm curious if you would think that would be some kind of malfunction of the dashboard going on where we're getting different messages. What do you think of that kind of thing?
I wouldn't see it as a malfunction. I don't think nature has been metacognitively designed with a specific purpose, because that would be required for us to talk about malfunction. Malfunction is when something happens that doesn't contribute to that specific purpose. I don't think nature was designed in this way. I think nature is spontaneous. It unfolds itself spontaneously based on what it is. I think the physical world is a appearance. It is the dashboard, or it is the virtual reality, whatever metaphor you prefer, so long as you keep in mind that it's a metaphor. And evolution by natural selection has constructed this virtual reality or this dashboard for the purposes of survival in the earthly planetary ecosystem, given the conditions and circumstances of that ecosystem. Now, those conditions and circumstances do not include travel at close to the speed of light. So that dashboard did not have to evolve to make sense of that particular space in the possible circumstances. Nobody runs around that close to the speed of light. Relativity effects did not take place in Paleolithic life before we developed technology. So the dashboard doesn't need to make sense under those circumstances. It didn't evolve to allow us to survive in those circumstances. Those circumstances were utterly irrelevant for our survival as an animal running around planet Earth. So it's not a malfunction of the dashboard. It's just that the dashboard was not made in such a way that we have intuitive that we can make intuitive sense of relativity effects.
Yeah.
It didn't
So what
evolve
you
for that. Our cognitive apparatus didn't evolve for that. That was not the purpose of the dashboard.
so that would be the same reason why quantum mechanics would seem wacky to us, because we don't have need to make sense of relativity to eat and breed and whatever. Well, let me ask you this then. Let's say that evolution continues to take place here on Earth for another 5 million years, and we make it, and we're these far more sophisticated beings with a more sophisticated dashboard, a more sophisticated set of senses. What do you think a dashboard 5 million years down the road might be like? Could we potentially make sense of more information?
I think it is not implausible that at some point we will be able to re-engineer our cognitive system. I mean, Elon Musk is trying to do something like that. I don't think it is implausible that at some point we may succeed in that to a degree that we cannot even imagine of today, or at least we can't imagine the consequences of doing that, what it will do to our understanding of what reality is, our understanding of ourselves, of our role in life. I think that's entirely plausible. But if you ask me to predict what will happen then, it's very hard. I can make some safe predictions, but I will stop early in that speculative road, because I don't want to speculate beyond what I can ground in some reason.
Yeah.
But certain things I think are very reasonable to expect. One of them is Aristotelian logic will be understood to be relatively arbitrary. In other words, it's not only that the laws of physics may be understood to be different, but the self-evident axioms of our logic may be understood to be arbitrary, a result of certain evolutionary traits, and not a fundamental statement about what reality is. And that is something that very few people can touch today, because we have this notion that logic is self-evidently true. And very few people have the realization that logic, although it feels self-evidently true, it requires no proof. It doesn't even require argument. It's evidently true. Very few people realize that that's based on axioms, a set of assumptions about what may or can or is allowed to be true and what is not allowed to be true. And we know today that in small specialist areas of study, there are alternative logics that are not Aristotelian logic, the one we use without thinking about. Certain constructionist logics. There are alternative logics out there, and I think if we start hacking into the virtual reality headset or hacking into our cognitive system and therefore changing the appearances, literally, we will understand the arbitrary nature of logic to an extent that would freak out 99.9% of people in the world today. And I think today there are a few hints of that. Like today we are, unlike 10 years ago, we are surprisingly able to talk about the UFOs or UAPs, whatever it's called now, in a reasonable way, without running into knee-jerk prejudicial reactions. But one of the things about the behavior of these UFOs or UAPs is how illogical it seems to be. Flight paths that make no sense. I mean, you cannot understand why it's doing that. There is no conceivable reason why it's doing that. People who report the so-called phenomenon of alien abductions, which I don't take literally, but I take seriously, the stories they report are absurd, to the point that I think that the witnesses that report absurd stories are more credible than the witnesses that report a very tightly neat, very reasonable and plausible story, because to me, that's the footprint of somebody who is inventing it and is trying to get across as someone who had a plausible experience. The people who are so marked by the experience that they just report it the way it came to them, will report things that are absurd, that defy our logic. To me, that's a hallmark of a degree of sincerity, a degree of honesty. And this ties into your question. I think there might be a point where we will hack into our cognitive system enough that suddenly what is completely illogical now will make sense.
Let's step off the path. I want to ask you what you think about these UAPs. What do you think's really going on with these crafts that we can't make sense of?
I think what's really going on would surprise us a lot more than this banal little theory that these are just metal spaceships from another star system. I think
Yeah.
what's going on goes much deeper. I have a feeling that even the idea that it's extraterrestrial is a rush to judgment, because it presupposes that we know everything relevant there is to know about planet Earth and what's happening here. And therefore, we know that that kind of thing cannot be from here. But this presupposition is gratuitous. We don't know what's happening in 99% of the ocean bottom. We don't know what's happening in the mantle or in the core of planet Earth. I'm not saying that Earth is hollow or any of that stuff. I'm just saying we have models for all these things. We have assumptions. We have a sense of plausibility about what might be happening and what might not be happening. But we don't know everything that may be salient to the phenomenon when it comes to planet Earth. Even our physics is the current state of our epistemology. It's not absolute. Maybe we understand things about physics in the future that will make space for that kind of phenomenon unfolding and being off the Earth and not from off the Earth. In any case, my very strong guess and my suggestion is, when we begin figuring out what it is, it will not be just little green men in metal spaceships from another planet. I think it goes a lot deeper than that.
When you say deeper than that, are you specifically thinking there might be something under the water here on Earth? And I don't want to go on about this, but
I don't mean anything that prosaic, although it could be. I cannot discard that either. But what I mean is things that for us to understand would require a revision of our understanding of the laws of physics and of our understanding of logic itself. It would require a revision of our understanding of our own understanding, of our own ability to cognize. It will require that much to be made sense of. And that's not what people expect. People think that it would be already amazing if these were little green men from another star system that arrived here on a beryllium spaceship with some kind of, how is it called? Anti-gravity drive. I know that there is this guy in the US who claims to have reverse engineered this stuff. I don't think it will be just that. I think that will sound so banal, so prosaic once we realize what we are really dealing with here, that most people just go like, oh my God.
I hope that we get to a result on all that within my lifetime. I would like to know.
The point I'm trying to make, just to be more explicit, what I'm trying to hint at, people think that the UAP phenomenon will reveal unexpected things about what is out there beyond the Earth. My guess is it will reveal enormously unexpected things about us. You see the difference?
Well, let me go back even before that. Is it possible that this is one part lies, one part dashboard hallucination, one part mechanical malfunction, or do you think that that's just...
Of course, it's all of it. Of course. I mean, there is no question that there is a gigantic part of it that is outright lie. I mean, the UFO industry moves a lot of money around.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to point at anyone specifically, but of course there is a lot of lying, a lot of making up. People want to earn a buck. I mean, it's human nature, surely. And certainly there's a lot of good faith confusion and misunderstanding. I mean, there was a video, not just a YouTube video from some anonymous person on the internet, but a professionally produced documentary that I happened to watch a part of some years ago. And I was amazed because there was a segment of some 10 minutes in which people paid good money to go to some kind of farm in the US, in an area with very little urbanization, open fields. And then there was a leader, and they would do a ceremony, and then they would look up in the sky, and there would be these little white dots going across the sky, and people would go, "Oh my God, it's a UFO! It's a UFO! We've seen the UFO!" And the leader would say, "Yes, they came because we called them up." I was flabbergasted because those were satellites. Anyone can go to their backyard, look up in the sky long enough, and you will see small, tiny dots of white light traveling at a constant speed in a straight line. Anytime, stay out and look up for more than 5 minutes, and you will see a lot of them. But there was I was flabbergasted with that. To the extent of both human greed and human stupidity. It's shocking. And these are the kinds of things that make me re-entertain the idea I always have in the back of my mind of buying a chalet in the Swiss Alps and disappearing in some remote valley there and never showing my face again. Because, taking part in the collective madness of humanity is taxing. Let's put
I
it
think
that
that's
way.
why the study of history is so interesting, because we do the most unusual, whacked out shit, we humans do. It's an interesting study. I want to ask you, as I finish up with my physics questions here, and I will say that one of the things that leads me to think what you're saying could very well be right is that it does seem to make more sense of physics than materialism does, which that would be one of my facts, that we can point at physics and say idealism fits with this very well. But what do you think is happening with the dashboard? In quantum mechanics, we have this thing that happens where we go from particles being in a probabilistic potential state to solidifying into an actual state. A decoherence happens there. And I'm just curious what you make of that process as far as analytical idealism and the dashboard goes.
Decoherence is a very useful theoretical tool. It doesn't provide an ontological resolution to the measurement problem. And this is not polemical, what I just said. It's not disputed. It's acknowledged by the fathers of decoherence. In other words, you cannot appeal to decoherence to say, oh, we already made sense of the measurement problem, of how reality can come from overlapping possibilities to one concrete observed option. Decoherence doesn't make sense of that, and I'll tell you why. When we are doing an experiment, we usually hold a quantum system in a superposition by not allowing it to interact with the environment. So we can use magnetic traps. There are all kinds of things that allow us to hold a quantum system in a superposition without allowing it to interact. And that environment that it cannot interact with is a classical environment. It's not in a superposition. It's the reality we see, and we see only one reality, not an overlap of all kinds of possibilities. So if you assume that that's the starting point, and that's a valid assumption operationally, because that's what happens in a laboratory. The laboratory is classical. The quantum system you're holding in a superposition is not classical. And then when you touch that quantum system, and I'm using the word touch loosely in the sense of measuring something about it. When you measure that quantum system, then of course, it has come in contact with the environment, with your measurement probe, your measurement instrument, whatever you use to measure it. And it then decoheres. In other words, information about the superposition penetrates the environment, becomes dilute in the environment, because the environment is much bigger than the original microscopic quantum system. So when the information about the superposition enters the environment, it becomes so diluted that you can no longer discern it. It's like saying if you drop one drop of dye in a glass of water, and it's blue dye, you will see the glass of water turning blue. But if you dropped one drop of blue dye in the ocean, you would not see it anymore. It would disappear. It would decohere. But so this is very useful operationally. But notice the following. It doesn't explain how the environment became classical to begin with. And that is the measurement problem. Why is there anything at all that is classical? because everything should be in a superposition on the face of it in quantum mechanics. So
Yeah.
decoherence is a very useful operational tool in terms of telling us how to conduct experiments, but it doesn't solve any philosophical problem at all. It presupposes the solution by presupposing that the environment is classical. So when we say there's a huge classical environment and the superposition becomes invisible because it gets diluted in this huge environment, it's already presupposing what it's trying to solve, which is how the classicality of the environment emerged in the first place. So this is something that a lot of people who do not understand quantum mechanics in any depth, usually people who portray themselves as skeptics, when somebody like me appeals to quantum mechanics having debunked physical realism, they say, bullshit, decoherence solves the problem. Well, they should talk to the fathers of decoherence and
I
ask them
thought
what.
decoherence was the problem here. I must be lost.
Oh, no, it's often used as an argument for saying quantum physics does not invalidate physicalism
But that
because of
doesn't make any
decoherence.
sense.
Yeah, well, you know that, I know that, but a lot of people think that decoherence is a magical world that reconciles quantum physics with materialism or physicalism, but unfortunately it doesn't. And the fathers of decoherence know this. They're still alive, by the way. One can talk to them, send an email.
Yeah. Let's go on to something that's interesting, and we'll get into some psychology here and how psychology might support analytical idealism. This is what we use in the United States to diagnose a mental disorder. It's the DSM-5. I got my copy when they first came out and were a lot more expensive than they are now. But there's a mental illness that some have said is the most extreme mental illness a person can face, at least in some ways, and that's dissociative identity disorder. Why don't you just inform the audience what that is and how that comes into play in making sense of analytical idealism?
Okay, the dissociative identity disorder is an extreme form of dissociation. Dissociation is happening all the time. So when you don't remember something, when you're dreaming, you're dissociated from the part of your mind that's generating the rest of the dream. You think you are not that, but it is still your mind. So you're dissociated from parts of your own mind. But DID is an extreme form in which one mind, the mind of one person, seemingly fragments itself into multiple personalities. And each of those personalities holds a different set of memories and a different set of the original character traits. You can have a dissociated personality or alter, which is how they are technically called, that is your child self with the opinions and knowledge and memories of your child self and has no longer access to your adult memories or to your adult cognition, your adult opinions, your adult way of interacting with life. You can have another personality that is of a different gender. Psychologically, we all know that if you're male or female, it's the degree of emphasis on a certain set of character traits that are usually associated with gender. But we all have some traits that belong to the other gender. Otherwise, no man would display nurturing behavior towards animals, towards their pets. But we do. We cuddle with our pets, and that's that's a feminine trait in a man. And what determines the gender you actually express is where the emphasis, which traits have an emphasis. But a dissociated personality could lose access to the dominant traits and center on the dominated trait. So you could have an alter that is of a different gender. And there are people who have a whole variety of alters. And usually that happens as a mechanism of protection against trauma. No single alter has the whole dramatic story of what happened to you. No single alter has the complete story about your terrible image of yourself. So they sort of, it becomes protective, so to say. But the alters have at least seemingly, they have their own perspective. They have their own views, their own stream of consciousness. They do not access, not always, this is not always the case, but often they do not access the experiences of another alter. Sometimes they don't even know the other alters exist at all.
Yeah.
And we also know that this is not just a matter of one alter at a time, like you're rebooting your computer with a new operating system. We know now that the alters can coexist at one time. One is associated with the executive ego, so you only see one of them manifesting, but the other alters are at the back and they are still co-conscious. And we know that because patients of DID can have dreams in which different alters partake in the same dream from their own individuated perspective, and they see the other alters as other characters in the dream. And when the patient wakes up, each alter tells the dream from its own perspective and reports on the presence of the other alters.
God,
So
that would be such a sophisticated experiment to try to do as the scientist, but go ahead.
this has been done by Harvard
No,
Medical
I
School.
believe that it's been done, but it just seems like it would be a challenging experiment because let me shut up and let you keep talking.
We cannot induce this level of dissociation. That's what we can't do. But we can still shove people in a dissociative state under a functional MRI, under a brain scanner, under an EEG cap, and we find out all kinds of amazing things. Like 2015, two neuroscientists or psychiatrists in Germany, they had a woman who had multiple alters, and uniquely, some of the alters claimed to be blind, not to be able to see a thing. And they had this great idea: let's hook her up to an EEG. And when sighted alters were in executive control, brain activity in the visual cortex here at the back of the brain was normal. They could detect that in the EEG scan, no problem. But when a sighted alter assumed control, brain activity in the visual cortex would disappear, even though the woman's eyes were open and her eyes worked perfectly right. I mean, you can't fake this. So dissociation has the power of being literally, not only figuratively, but literally blinding. It can literally blind you. Actually, blind sight is most likely an instance of a dissociative process in which you lose metacognitive awareness of an experience that you do have. So you report not having the experience, but in fact you do. So you react according to the experience, although you say, I couldn't perceive it. So it's all very interesting, and there is little doubt since the 21st century and the emergence of neuroimaging that dissociation is a real condition. The ID is a real condition. There was a study done in the Netherlands. They scanned the brains of people diagnosed with DID, and actors who were paid to pretend to themselves, this is a well-known acting technique, to pretend to themselves that they were in the dissociative state, and they put both groups on their brain scanner, and they wanted to see whether just by analyzing the scan's readings, one would be able to categorize the two groups correctly without actually knowing who was what. And then they could. So dissociation is real, and what people report happens to them does happen. And most phenomenally, we know that this fragmentation of the mind into multiple centers of awareness is not fundamental. It is illusory, because some people recover from dissociation and they reintegrate the memories and experiences of all the different alters, and they recognize those as experiences of them, of the host personality. Upon reintegration, they know that it was the host who was each and every one of the alters. Just as you know when you wake up that you were your dream avatar, that the dream avatar was you.
Right.
When you wake up, you realize it was me all along, and I was doing the whole thing. I was doing the trees, the forests, the buildings, and the dream avatar. I thought these things were different, but they were not. They were all me. A patient of DID who reintegrates the alters says that they suddenly become, not suddenly, they become aware that it was them all along. But during the dissociation, they don't know that. Just as during the dream, you don't know that. Dream is a dissociative state. So this is relevant, sorry for the long answer, but this is relevant for the following reason. There are three mainline metaphysical hypotheses on the table today. One is materialism or physicalism, and it faces the so-called hard problem of consciousness. There is nothing about physical parameters in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience. Another main line is constitutive panpsychism, the idea that subatomic or elementary subatomic particles have consciousness as one more fundamental property. So they have charge, they have mass, they have spin, and they also have conscious states. And then that faces a problem too, the combination problem. If that's the case, how can these little consciousnesses combine with each other inside our heads to produce my unitary consciousness in our life.
Yeah.
And the third line is idealism. There is only one consciousness, but then you face the decomposition problem. How do you explain that I can't read your thoughts and you can't read mine, and I don't know what's happening in the center of the sun? How can you make sense of this if it's all happening in one mind? So each of the three alternatives faces a problem, but only one of them has a solution that is clearly manifesting nature in a way that doesn't beg the question. And that is idealism, because we know dissociative identity disorder happens. We know that one mind can seem to itself to be many in a very, very convincing, compelling way. And this mind sees the other parts of it as characters in a collective dream. Now, this only happens for idealism. There is no empirical solution to the hard problem of consciousness unless you beg the question. In other words, if you say, well, it's happening all the time, like in my mind, well, you're begging the question. You're assuming that which you want to prove if you point to that. The same for constitutive panpsychism. There is no empirical evidence for combination in nature unless you beg the question. But for idealism, you don't need to beg the question. Whether you're a materialist, a panpsychist, or an idealist, we know that dissociation happens. One mind can seem to itself to be many. So the argument is, this is what's happening. It's a form of universal level dissociation. And life is what these alters look like to each other within this shared dream.
So when someone takes a drug like psilocybin, or maybe even they meditate, when it comes to this disassociated boundary, what's happening when someone takes something like psilocybin? Are they breaching through that boundary, or is the boundary breaking down, allowing us to peer in, or what do you think happens with someone that's in that kind of heightened state?
Look, I think what we call brain activity is what the dissociative processes and its contents look like to observation. That's what the brain is. That's what brain activity is. It's the way the dissociation looks like from a perspective, namely from across its dissociative boundary. So certain types of brain activity correspond to the dissociative process itself. Other types of brain activity simply correspond to the contents of the dissociation, particular thoughts, particular emotions. But there must be something the dissociation itself, that process of dissociation, looks like. And that must be part of what we call our brain activity. Because if the body is what the dissociation looks like, then some parts of metabolism in the brain should be what the dissociative process itself looks like, not only its contents, but the process itself.
Yeah.
And we know that there are certain things we can do to impair our ordinary brain activity. You drink alcohol and you do that. You get shot in the head, you do that. And get punched in the nose and something happens. But certain impairments of brain activity seem to affect the dissociative process more specifically. They impair the dissociation itself, not only the contents of the dissociation. And psychedelics seem to do exactly that. Psychedelics only reduce brain activity. We know that today. No psychedelic lights up your brain like a Christmas tree.
That's incredible. Yeah.
We've known that for 9 years now. All psychedelics that have been studied reduce brain activity. None of them increases brain activity. And yet we have this enormously intense and rich experience that, according to studies, ranks as one of the 5 most significant experiences in one's life. The others being the death of a parent, the birth of a child, and only heavyweight stuff. And a psychedelic experience is right there, ranking in the top 5, sometimes the very first place. So what's going on? I think what's going on is that that brain activity that is reduced by psychedelics, that's just the appearance of the reality that corresponds to the image we call a psychedelic, of that reality impairing the dissociative process itself, rendering the dissociative boundary more porous, more permeable. So what we are experiencing are parts of reality beyond our dissociation, beyond what we call our personal selves. It's part of the surrounding mental milieu in which we are immersed, and which appears to our observation through the sense organs as the physical world. But the physical world is just an appearance, the appearance of an underlying reality that we cannot see or perceive directly, because perception is already an appearance. Maybe through a psychedelic trance, we actually can become acquainted with that underlying reality directly and not through perception. And if that underlying reality is mental, as I maintain, then you will feel that acquaintance as a psychedelic trip, a mental trip, a trip of emotions, a trip of insights, of cognition at every scale, of strange thoughts, strange logic, not only visions, but visions too, which is what we translate it to when we come back. So I
Yeah.
think that's what's happening, not only with psychedelics, but with acquired savant. If you get shot in the head in just the right way, and by the way, we don't know what the right way is, so nobody should try to do that. But if
Yeah.
you get struck by lightning or shot in the head, or even if you develop dementia that happens to affect the parts of your cognition that are correlated with the dissociative process itself, you become a savant. You can do mathematical calculations that no
Yeah.
human being can do. You can remember everything that happened in your life every single day for the past 60 years and tell that in details, like what the weather was, what the temperature was, and what were the news that day. Or you can develop skills, artistic talent that would be completely unimaginable to you before that trauma that sort of liberated your mind to pick up on what's going on beyond the dissociation. We know that the Vietnam War veterans that suffered brain trauma uh, are a lot more prone to spiritual experience than the average person. We know that people who undergo brain surgery for the removal of tumors and have collateral damage in the surrounding tissue, they score much higher in a scale of feelings of self-transcendence than ordinary people do. I mean, these are all laboratory studies. This is not anecdotal evidence. These are controlled studies, many of them prospective studies, which cannot be accounted for under regular mainstream physicalism. Because if experience is generated by brain activity, how can you have the most intense and rich experience of your life when your brain is effectively going to sleep as far as its
Yeah.
activity? But idealism, or analytic idealism in particular, can easily account for it.
You know, I saw this something on television once. There was this guy, he was a normal guy in his 30s, hit his head one day, went unconscious, came back to consciousness. And for a period of time, he said he was having these kind of like geometrical visual hallucinations. And he all of a sudden had this intuition for doing math. He was actually doing math one day as a hobby at a shopping mall, and a mathematician asked him what he was doing and told him to take courses at the local school or whatever happened with him. But the guy got good at math. And I'm curious, where does that information come from? If I take a knock to the head and all of a sudden I'm just great with physics and numbers, how does that happen?
Clearly, there is something beyond ourselves that can do that.
Yeah.
And we are accessing that. I mean, it's preposterous to explain acquired savant as a hidden talent that somehow you developed throughout your life without knowing, because this would be contrary to evolution. If you have that hidden talent, why wouldn't you be able to use that? And how did you develop that? How did you learn it? Did you train it? And why do we need to train to learn to do engineering if by getting knocked in the head suddenly I can do advanced mathematics? So there is something beyond our dissociated selves that is not bound by space-time extension. Now, since Kant in the late 18th century, we have contemplated this idea that space-time is not an objective scaffolding of the world out there. It's a mode of cognition. It's a category of perception. It's something that our cognitive system creates to allow us to make sense of our environment. It's not a fundamental property of the world outside. Outside, there is no space-time. Space-time is how we sort of lined up our knowledge in order to be able to have that feeling, okay, I grasp it, I understand it. Kant put this forward, Schopenhauer confirmed it, and Donald Hoffman today is sort of proving it. And even loop quantum gravity, which is saying time is not absolute, is playing to that, because if it's not absolute, then it's created by something that we associate with our heads. Therefore, it's not out there. And even lines of research in neuroscience is showing that even our perception of time is so incredibly relative that even the relative order of events can be inverted if our perception of time is subjectively manipulated. Um, so all lines of evidence are converging to that. And the conclusion would be, well, space-time is something we are doing within the alter. It's a mode of the alter's cognition. But if you impair that, if you sort of hack that in an unintended way through an accident, through trauma, suddenly you may be able to operate outside the boundaries of space-time. And that may give you these unbelievable skills that we call acquired savant. Knowledge across space, knowledge across time. So when you say, well, how can a savant calculate all that so fast, faster than a computer can, a modern computer can? Well, it's because it's not in time. So the very idea of fast or slow is not applicable.
Let me ask you this, because you know more about this acquired savant syndrome than I do. Is it just a capability that's acquired, or is it actually like a body of knowledge that suddenly someone has?
It's usually a capability of performing math calculations incredibly fast. Again, fast is not applicable, but that's how it's described. Memory capabilities. An ability to remember every single detail of every single day on the drop of a dime. Now, that also has to do with space-time. Is it a memory, or you're just cutting across time and reliving that? You don't need to remember anything, you just go back. And then it will come across as remembrance, but you didn't remember anything, you didn't store any information. There is not information capacity in the brain to remember every single detail of your life. The brain is a warm system. It doesn't have the coherence necessary for storing information in a classical way at that level. But maybe these guys, they're not calculating and they're not remembering. They're just cutting across space-time. And that's why it looks so puzzling to us, because we are framed by space-time limitations.
I want to ask you about near-death experiences, because a lot of people bring this up, and seems like scientists a lot of times are really skeptical of this, as have I been. I actually knew a guy, I had a friend once who, he was working at this place that produced these big rolls of sandpaper, these huge, heavy rolls of sandpaper. He went through a machine there and had a near-death experience where he thought he met Jesus and everything. And I don't necessarily buy that. In fact, I don't buy it. But I'm curious what you think about near-death experiences. If mind at large is kind of an unadulterated awareness without memories and whatnot, what happens when someone has a near-death experience? Do they actually die and go somewhere and come back like they seemingly report? And how would they retain a memory of where they went if where they went was just unadulterated consciousness? What do you think about near-death experiences?
I don't think universal consciousness has no memories. I don't think it operates within space-time. So even the very notion of memory is sort of precarious. It's not applicable. But I would say it has something that we would call memory. Because if you're operating outside time, then there is no loss of memory because everything is happening here and now. What I usually say to prevent misunderstanding is that, in my view, mind at large is not metacognitive. It's not planning things like we do. It's not thinking things through. It's not self-aware. It's not self-reflective. It's instinctive. It's doing what it's doing spontaneously. But not necessarily that it has no memories. I think if life is dissociation, then death is the end of dissociation by implication. And what is the end of dissociation? It's a remembrance by the host personality of what used to be the inner life of an alter before. So if what's going on is a universal mind and we are dissociated aspects of it, then the memories we have of our lives, not only episodic memories of what happened, but also interior memories, how we thought, how we felt, our insights, our regrets, our hopes, all of that becomes reintegrated in the host personality, the universal mind. I don't think the history of our lives disappears. I think, on the contrary, it becomes available to the whole as opposed to available only to a small dissociated subset. So I think that a near-death experience, if you cut through the surface appearances of different metaphors, of different categories, because you see, we are symbolic beings. We think symbolically. Um, to make sense of our own experiences, we need to match them to pre-existing categories, be it space-time, a major category, of smaller categories, like if you experience unconditional love, you say, well, I experience Jesus. It's very hard for us to be neutral in our descriptions of our own experiences to ourselves. We have to match them to the categories available to us so we can tell ourselves what we experienced. And we need to do that as human beings. Human beings need to tell themselves what they experience. Only then the experience becomes really real. Before that, it's fleeting and tenuous, so to say. So it is that translation process where the idiosyncrasies arise. A Christian will experience unconditional love and say, I was in the arms of Jesus. A Buddhist would say, I met Krishna. And an atheist will say, I met my grandmother.
Sure.
We have different categories that we consider plausible or accessible, or which are emotionally evocative to us. And we use the category that matches the experience the best and triggers the emotions. And of course, that will vary from person to person, even though the core of the experience may be identical. So I think people who describe near-death experiences in completely different ways are just reflecting this category matching that we all necessarily do. It's part of being human. What I think is more interesting is if we try to dig one level below and look at the core of the experience, not the metaphors, not the imagery, but the core, it is surprisingly consistent. I found I'm not really a student of the field. I know people who are, dedicate their lives to studying it, and they're very serious, very rigorous researchers, very good, reliable thinkers. But I'm not one of those. But the little I did look, because I have these acquaintances, to me it was like, oh, interesting that the underlying themes are so common, even though the imagery on top and the categories of description are so diverse. So I think there is a possibility that these experiences are authentic, that there is a experience beyond the boundaries of the altar that have as central themes unity, reintegration, acceptance, unconditional love, and this all sounds like the end of dissociation. Reintegration, acceptance, you go back to where you came from, the dissociative boundaries go down. Um, I may be sort of tendentious here because, of course, I want to see in the data a reflection of my existing opinion. I'm keenly aware that I'm vulnerable to this fallacy. So you have to take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But to me, at face value, it's like, interesting. It seems consistent with what I would expect. And from the point of view of the universal mind that receives those contents after the dissociation ends, I think it would be similar to your wake up mind after a dream. When you wake up, you know that, okay, I was the dream and I was the character in the dream. Actually, that character in the dream is dead when you wake up. The character in the dream, your dream avatar is gone. It's toast when you wake up. It's gone, dead. But you don't mourn the death of the character of your dream avatar, because you realize, oh, I was him all along. It was me all along. So I think that's what happens from the point of view of the universal mind when we die, when the dissociation ends. It's the remembrance of your whole inner life outside time and a recognition of it as itself. The recognition of what you think is your inner life, your life memories, a recognition that actually it was that universal mind all along. It knows it, so to say. And it remembers, because I don't think there is any need for us to think that it would be subject to the cognitive category we call time outside the dissociation. So even to talk about remembering is inconsistent because it presupposes time. But it would have the information available to it outside time. And I think it would recognize it. Oh, it was me all along.
So there are two things I just want to make sure that I'm clear on. When someone, say, takes a drug or meditates, it's not that they're going anywhere or that anything's coming in. It's that there is a breakdown of the the dissociation boundary and there's an emergence that occurs. Is that in the right ballpark?
I think, to be very strict, I think what's happening is not susceptible to space-time metaphors, because space-time
Hard
are
for me to not
categories.
come back around to that.
Yeah, because look, space is a not only a useful, it's an unavoidable metaphor in human communication, because language presupposes space. So if you're going to sort of not make the spatial assumption, you cannot open your mouth and say anything,
Right.
because language presupposes space and time, verbs and nouns and subject and object and all that, tenses and all that. So it's a very useful metaphor to talk about the dissociation in spatial terms. Like there is something outside the dissociative boundary and something inside the dissociative boundary. Even I draw things this way. But again, we have to pay attention to the fact that this is a metaphor. So we always have to be cautious about it. Ultimately, dissociation is not a spatial process. It is a cognitive process. So the spatial metaphor is just that. It's a metaphor. There's no outside and inside. There is only a dynamics of cognition, cognitive elements that are associated with one another and therefore evoke one another, and cognitive elements that are inferentially isolated. They cannot evoke one another. Like you cannot evoke you cannot evoke my memories from your point of view because you are dissociated from me. But if we were alters of one personality and the dissociation ended, then the resulting host personality would be able to evoke your memories and my memories and recognize both as its own. These are cognitive phenomena. You have to think of them, strictly speaking, in terms of information theory, not in terms of time and space. But I am plenty guilty of using spatial metaphors because I also want to be understood by the common person on the street, not only by information theory experts. But if you press me for details, then I have to say, oh, okay, this is where the metaphor ends, and we have to think about it more correctly in terms of information theory, in terms of cognition, and not in spatial terms. Dissociation is not a spatial phenomenon. It's not a spatial-temporal phenomenon. Spatial-temporal metaphors are just our way to communicate it, to try to tell about it. But dissociation is a cognitive phenomenon. It doesn't need to unfold in space-time.
I've got to remember that fact when I'm investigating these issues, because it's almost like a fallacious way of thinking. Hell, maybe I've got it wrong with Tom Campbell. Maybe I've been thinking about things incorrectly and getting the wrong message. I'll have to deeply consider that as I continue to study.
If you're a computer scientist, you can think of it in terms of how you build databases. Computer scientists, they don't think in spatial or temporal terms, certainly not in spatial terms. When they're building databases, they are just establishing links between records and how those links can be evoked and pursued. So everything happens in a sort of abstract, semantic, I was going to say semantic space, but I need to avoid the word space. In an abstract semantic domain. And of course, physically, it will become something in space, in the chip memory and hard disks and so on. But we think of databases as semantically associative systems. And everything that is important about those systems unfolds in a semantic domain that can be projected on space, but theoretically and in principle is not spatial. That's how one has to think of dissociation. Dissociation is something that happens within a cognitive semantic domain, and it can be projected onto space to be communicated, but that's just a metaphor. The thing in itself, the process itself, is intrinsically cognitive and semantic, not spatial.
That's a great point. Maybe I should have asked you this earlier on, and it might be good to ask it now for the final questions that I have for you. But did Mind at Large plan on a universe with planets and people and evolution? Is this all intentional, or what do you think about that?
I don't think it has planned it at all. I don't think it in itself, meaning without us, because we are parts of it as well. We are parts of universal consciousness. But if I define Mind at Large as what is left of universal consciousness after you have accounted for life, So let's define it that way. Mind at large is what's left of universal consciousness after you have accounted for us for the rest of life. What is left of it, I'll call it mind at large. Defined this way, I don't think mind at large is metacognitive at all. If it were, metacognition would be a fundamental property of all mentation, and a paramecium would be metacognitive. We wouldn't have required 3.5 billion years of evolution to develop self-awareness and metacognition. My cats don't seem to be able to metacognize. They don't walk around saying, I feel hungry, I need to eat. No, they act spontaneously. They act through instinct. They actually do eat. The result is the same, but they don't plan to eat. The action unfolds spontaneously. A paramecium also goes after food spontaneously. I don't think it thinks to itself, I am a paramecium and that is food. That is not me, but I need that. Therefore, if I feel hungry, I need to go after. No. I don't think none of that's happening. It's unfolding spontaneously because, we seem to be the only clear example of metacognition, and it took 3.5 billion years to make us, and a lot of blood spilled through the evolution of life on this planet. A lot of suffering, a lot of pain, a lot of carnage. So it's a capability that has been acquired at unimaginable cost. So why would I think that it was there from the beginning? I don't think it. I think metacognition is something that authors have evolved because of their need to survive in a planetary ecosystem. It's that need to survive that has pushed the development of higher level mental functions like self-reflection, self-awareness, the ability to plan deliberately, the ability to introspect explicitly. I don't think these are mental capacities that are there in mind at large, because mind at large, again, is what's left after you have accounted for evolved life. So I think mind at large is instinctive. It does what it does because it is what it is. It acts spontaneously. It may feel and experience impetus. Surely, a paramecium experiences the impetus to eat. My cat definitely experiences the impetus to eat and to disrupt me when I'm giving an interview. It's a very clear impetus that my cats have, but it's not planned. It's not premeditated. It doesn't happen through an explicit thinking of the subject-object relationship. It just happens. It's spontaneous. So I don't think mind at large has planned what's happening now, even though it may have had, and certainly had, the impetus to go somewhere. Otherwise, the universe wouldn't be dynamic. It wouldn't be doing anything. Supernovae wouldn't be exploding. Galaxies wouldn't be forming. Volcanoes wouldn't be erupting. That all this stuff is happening means that mind at large experiences impetus that leads to action. But I don't think that action is deliberate, planned, weighed. It just happens. It's spontaneous and instinctive, I think.
Do you think that it would be, let's say that I were to die and I'm not this being that I am in my altar anymore. I'm back to the oneness with mind at large. Would that be a less valuable state to be in than I'm in right now? What do you think?
I think clearly, very clearly, because, at least on this planet, life pops everywhere where it can conceivably pop. Geothermal vents at 300 degrees Celsius, you look, there is life. Not only microscopic life, there are shrimp-like creatures. Life is everywhere. It has a tremendous resilience. Look at the exclusion zone around Chernobyl. We had a major radioactive incident there only 36 years ago, and it's filled with life. So, the universe seems to be very interested in doing this thing we call life, which is a state of mind. Biology is just the way this state of mind appears or looks like when observed from across a dissociative boundary. I think what life essentially is a state of mind, a particular state of mind. It seems to be very, very valued because it's happening all the time. There is an impetus towards it. Schopenhauer wrote extensively about it, about the blind impetus of the will to produce life. So something about this state of mind we are going through that's so prone to suffering, despite all the suffering, there seems to be something about it towards which nature feels an irresistible impetus. So there is value to it. I'm not sure what it is. I suspect very strongly it has to do with metacognition, the ability to recognize oneself and reality and say, this is happening, as opposed to just being the blind throes of instinctual unfolding. There is a sense in which instinctual unfolding is not as real as when one takes explicit notice of what's happening and say, this is happening, and I know this is happening. There seems to be tremendous intrinsic value to this from the point of view of nature at large. And unfortunately, we focus on the suffering, and I'm guilty of that. I focus on the suffering. I don't focus on what we are contributing to nature, but to realize that it takes something that's very difficult for the Western mind, which is to contemplate the value of life, not based on what it gives you, but based on what it gives nature. We do not have the instinct to weigh things this way. It's all about us. What do I gain for being alive? If all I'm getting is suffering, then I'll kill myself, because there is no other value for my being alive other than the value I experience as a person. Well, I think nature is doing a very different calculation here. Nature is not thinking so pedestrianly locally. Nature is thinking about the whole system. It's a global optimization problem here. And nature seems to be saying, your life has a lot of value to me. Whether you recognize it or not is your problem.
You know, I have a question here, one of the last several that I have, and I guess maybe it doesn't make as much sense to me as it did before we started talking. It was the idea of reincarnation, but I guess that seems like maybe it just doesn't even make any sense. What do you think about that kind of idea? Because certainly I wouldn't come to be in another alter, not me, the identity that I'm using here to speak with you. It would. What do you think about reincarnation?
I think we tend to think about it in vulgar and fallacious terms. Sorry for using these words, but we think of it as, what is it that reincarnates? It's a soul. It's some kind of ghostly thing that occupies our body within space-time. And when the body dies, it sort of floats out and somehow enters another locus of space-time in somebody else's body and carries its own memories with it. Yeah. I think this is a vulgar way of thinking about this. To illustrate it, let me ask you this. Suppose that 5 minutes from now I were to die. And immediately after that, you were to have all my memories, all of them in every detail. Would you be a reincarnation of me?
That's a tough question.
Literally, you wouldn't, because you were already here while I am alive. But you would start reporting on my memories in such a way that you would convince everybody around you that you are my reincarnation, because you remember everything there is to remember about my life. You remember my life from a first-person perspective, not from the outside. You remember my life from the inside. And you may even remember certain character traits and preferences, because if you remember how I feel when I eat Brussels sprouts, which I love, but most people hate.
I love them too.
Man, I can tackle a plate of Brussels sprouts if they are properly cooked and not overcooked. I can tackle a plate of it alone. I don't need anything else. If you were a person who hates Brussels sprouts, but suddenly you had all my memories, including the memory of the pleasure of eating Brussels sprouts, suddenly you would start saying to yourself, oh, I have sort of inherited his taste. Because now I found a mental space where I like Brussels sprouts. So if you continue in this line of thinking, it will be very hard for you to convince people that you're not my reincarnation, because you start having my tastes, you have all my memories from a first-person perspective. No, you're my reincarnation, and yet nothing reincarnated. What happened was information transfer, patterns of mentation that are copied somewhere else, if we stick to the space-time metaphor. I think this is what's happening in cases of reincarnation. I think we are dissociated alters, so our inner life is prior to us, is private to us, because it's sort of circumscribed by the dissociative boundary that characterizes what we are. But when we die, the dissociative boundary is gone. our memories are now dispersed in a much larger whole. They become cognitively accessible to the whole, no longer dissociated from the whole. So the whole now is my reincarnation because it remembers all my life. It remembers the pleasure I had when eating Brussels sprouts. It remembers what it is like to be me. It remembers my tastes, my proclivities, my preferences, my character traits, everything. It experiences what it was like to be me because that's my mental inner life that's now cognitively accessible to the whole. So is the whole a reincarnation of me? Of course not. Now another alter formed, and that alter happened to form in just the right cognitive space that those memories sort of were captured by the dissociative boundary. And they are now accessible by a new alter. Somebody remembers what it was like to be me. Somebody that was born after I died remembers how much I loved the experience of tasting Brussels sprouts. That person is my reincarnation, right? You would, empirically, you'd be justified to come to this conclusion, although conceptually, it is precisely the wrong concept. Nothing reincarnated. There was no soul floating in space between one point to another. You see what I mean? It's
I
a
see what you're
cognitive
saying, yeah.
process. It's a dance of dissociation and reassociation that sometimes leads to a particular configuration in which mental contents that were locked in another dissociative context were freed and happened to be captured by a new dissociative context. Now, the fact that the reincarnation reports seem to be so rare statistically seem to give credence to what I'm saying, because if what I'm saying is correct, then the memories of another life entering another dissociative alter should be something that happens rarely, because it's a sort of more or less random cognitive process. The system is not set up for this to happen. It just happens sometimes because of all the possibilities that may unfold. This is one of them. Statistically, there are many others, so it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. It belongs in the realm of possibilities. And then somebody is born saying, oh, I was that pilot, I crashed in that plane, and I remember how horrible it was, and I was in love with that person. These are mental processes. These are experiences that have now ended up in another alter. In that big river of mentation that is unfolding around the alters, certain contents of mentation may be captured by another alter after a previous alter has died and released its inner life into a broader context. Nothing surprising about that. So I think for all intents and purposes, things happen sometimes as though reincarnation were true. For all intents and purposes, it is as though it could happen. But I don't think it is the right conceptual model for it.
I see. That was an illuminating thing that you just said there. I must say that when it comes to Brussels sprouts, that I actually like them well cooked. I know most people would say I like them like completely tender. And I actually
like
prefer
them
the frozen
firm.
ones. Do you like the fresh or the frozen, or what do you eat?
Oh, of course, I prefer the fresh ones. We grow Brussels sprouts in my garden, and the fresh ones are just so much more intense. People who don't like Brussels sprouts, I think, would spit out fresh Brussels sprouts because it's intense. It's a very rich flavor.
I've seen those for sale at the grocery store. I just don't think that I've ever picked them up. I'll have to try them here. I'll have to get some of the fresh ones and give them a try.
Yeah. They look worse. They don't look as nice as the ones that you buy in the big supermarkets. They are all clean and green. Real life Brussels sprouts, have broken leaves and insect holes in them.
Yeah. Let me ask you this about the alter process. Here's the question that I had written down. If we are all mind at large, why do we disagree on major issues? Wouldn't we see it the same? So I'm wondering what happens when mind at large, I hate to use the word infiltrate because that's probably some notion of space and time, but how does it happen that a personality is generated that could disagree with another part of mind at large?
Because of dissociation. When dissociation arises, it forms a particular perspective. You
Is
can
that
now start
random,
talking.
you think?
No, I think it's built into the process. It's entailed by dissociation, not even implied. When you form a dissociative process within a broader mental context, by definition, you've created a specific point of view within that broader mental context. And if another dissociation happens, then you have a separate, different point of view within that broader mental context. What is a point of view, and why is it different from one another? A point of view is a subset of a whole. And if the subsets are different, then there are different points of view. If I could see the world exactly from your eyes, with your memories and experience your preferences, I would be you. I wouldn't be dissociated from you, but I am dissociated from you. And in the context of space-time, we say I have a different perspective because I occupy a different volume of space at the same point in time, or the same volumes of space in a different point in time. But that's the spatial-temporal projection of a cognitive process. Cognitively speaking, dissociation entails the formation of separate and different points of view within a cognitive whole. And the moment you have different points of view, you open the door to disagreement, because now I do not have access to the entire mental context that motivates your opinions. Neither do you have access to the entire mental context that motivates my opinions. My opinions are driven by a particular set of references, the life I've had, the experiences I have had, the lessons I have learned, the insights I have developed. And those are different from you. You have had a different life, different childhood experiences. You've learned different things. You've had different insights. If this were not the case, look, if a San Francisco liberal could, for a moment, experience life exactly from the cognitive perspective point, from the cognitive point of view of a Texan conservative, that would be the moment when liberals would understand conservatives and the other way around. And they wouldn't go to war. And the reason they go to war is because they are operating on the basis of different references, different perspectives. They don't all have access to the same mental perspective. I'm tempted to use the word information, but it's too flat and abstract. What I'm talking about is not only information, it's felt information, lived experience.
Yeah.
If a liberal could have the experience of the life of a conservatist, the liberal would suddenly realize, oh, I understand why he is who he is, why he says what he says, and why he acts the way he does. If you think about it, you realize that it's impossible for it to be different. If somebody could have lived my entire life the way I did, having every experience I had, it would be impossible for that other person not to understand me and accept me.
Yeah.
It would be literally impossible. You cannot. So if we all had access to the whole, there would be no conflict. The reason there is conflict is that you cannot access my experiences completely. Therefore, you operate on the basis of different references and assumptions and experiences and learnings and all that. So you act differently, and we can get into conflict.
I had a question in mind that slipped from me. Shoot, I had a great question, and it slipped from me.
It will come back. The moment you stop trying to remember, it will come.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully I remember that, because I was going in a good direction there. But
speaking of my cat, look whose natural impetus has forced him to try to interrupt this interview because he's not getting enough attention. Right, buddy?
I have a cat myself.
I have 3.
I actually care for the cat population. There are homeless cats here in the area that I feed. I actually took them out a can of fish today, which some people say you shouldn't do that because feral cats, I don't know, but I feed them every day. So
I would do that too. We don't have we don't get to see many feral cats here. Usually the Society for the Protection of Animals, they collect them very quickly and they sort of prepare them for adoption. So if you see a cat on the streets here, it's an owned cat and it belongs to someone.
Does your cat go out, or is it an inside cat?
They only go to my garden. So I have a large garden, and they know they cannot go beyond that. And when they are young, they try to violate that rule. But now they are 3-4 years old, so they behave well.
I love gardening ever since I was a kid. We had a pretty good sized garden where I lived when I was a child, but I live in the city now, and there's actually kitty corner from where I live. There's about a one city block that's just land, and it's a community garden where you can rent a little plot. I have two of them over there, but
Yeah, we have that too here.
I like, I don't know, I guess it's therapeutic
Very much.
to garden.
Yeah.
It's not coming back to me. So let me go on with another line here. I've got just a couple more questions here. What do you think of psychic phenomenon? Actually, wait a minute. I remembered. Have you ever experienced deja vu?
Oh yeah. Sorry, my cat is doing crap here.
That's fine.
I have many times. Yeah.
I've heard people describe deja vu, and sometimes I think what they're describing is not actually deja vu. But I think I have experienced it. I remember when I was a teenager once, I walked into this shopping mall with my parents, and I had this almost like predictive power that came over me where I felt like I had not just lived something very similar to that before, but I had actually experienced that experience in the past. And it was like I was saying, well, a man's going to come walking out with a red shirt on and all. I was like, this is almost like a movie that I've seen a million times, and I know what's going to play out in front of me. I've been here. And it only lasted for, I don't know, no more than a minute, probably. They're usually brief on the several experiences that I've experienced that. What do you think happens with deja vu?
I think the fundamental nature of mind outside alters, so what was there before the first alter formed, that fundamental dynamics of mind is not within time. Because again, I am with Kant, Schopenhauer, and the loop quantum gravity theorists and the modern neuroscientists to say time is relative. It's not a fundamental thing. So time is a cognitive category of an alter, of a dissociative process. And I think what happens in deja vu is that, like every process in nature, dissociation is not perfect. It's not foolproof. No process in nature is foolproof. It's perfect, and so dissociation isn't that either. And deja vu is a mode of cognition that underlies the dissociation. It's there all the time, but we are blinded to it because we have evolved to think about things in spatial temporal terms. That has been very useful to survive. It's no use to know that there is a lion or a tiger prowling around in India if you're in North America. No, you will not survive better for that. So space-time sort of allows us to focus our cognitive resources on the here and now, which is another name for the subset of universal experiences that are relevant for the maintenance of the dissociation. In other words, for survival. But that process is not perfect. So every now and then we catch a glimpse of what is actually really going on. And I think what is really going on is outside time. And that's what's happening at all times. What's happening at all times is that it's not in time. But we are molded to frame everything according to the spatial temporal cognitive scaffolding. Sometimes we fail doing that. We are caught off guard. Sometimes the storytelling sort of gets interrupted because you're not paying attention or you're distracted. We drift out and then we catch a glimpse of what is actually going on. We call that deja vu because it's an experience that transcends time. There's no point of talking about time in a deja vu.
Yeah.
And of course, we try to give temporal language to it by saying it has happened before. No, it didn't happen before, and it's not going to happen. It happens now, and now. It just happens. It's part of what exists.
It really is kind of striking to me that during this conversation, I've realized that I'm always thinking about things in terms of space and time and matter.
It's unavoidable.
I've got to work some kind of exercises to help myself to get around that, at least to some degree.
Well, you cannot construct a satisfying intellectual story to yourself that is not in spatial temporal terms. It's impossible to do that. Logic precludes that from being possible. So to sort of live partly outside space-time, you have to be prepared to accept that there is something beyond logic. They're UAPs and the UFOs again, you know. You have to be prepared to accept that there is a mode of experiencing that does not require the approval of your intellectual self in order to be true and valid. If you always require approval from your intellectual self to validate every experience you have, then you are completely locked within space-time. And it's okay that it be like that. It's actually very, very human. It's very, very natural. There it is. It's very, very natural and understandable. But if you aspire to sort of glimpse what might actually be the case, what might actually exist um, beyond the boundaries of space-time, then you have to be prepared to sort of set your intellect slightly aside, not require a sort of seal of approval from it. And even then, it's a very ephemeral experience. What I can tell you from my own history is that ephemeral as it is, if you have that glimpse, that ephemeral glimpse, enough times in your life, it sort of builds up an internal edifice that you integrate, and you start partly living outside space and time. For me, for instance, and that happened only in my 40s. I'm going to turn 47 now. In my 30s, this would be unthinkable. But more and more, history for me is present. It's not the past. And I know it sounds completely illogical because, it is. It is illogical. But I'm not trying to convince you or make an argument about it towards you. I'm just reporting what is a lived reality for me. For me, more and more, history is not the past. History is right now. Yeah, I can't say more about it without sounding like an idiot, but yeah, you believe it or you don't.
Yeah. I want to touch on one more thing here before I ask you for some book recommendations. And you've probably already, yeah, she wants some attention, but you've probably already answered it. But we're going to talk about psychic phenomena here for a moment. I'm also curious here specifically, what do you think of out-of-body experiences? Because, yeah, what do you think of out-of-body experiences? What's going on there, if anything?
I think that represents a spontaneous weakening of the dissociative process, which gives us a direct insight of the actual world surrounding us. So without the intermediation of perception, but the thing in itself, parts of the thing in itself surrounding us, the non-physical essence of what's happening surrounding us. We get a glimpse of that, but then we immediately have to tell ourselves a story about what we experienced by coding it in perceptual categories. So a place you saw, shapes, colors, events, because that's the only internal language we've developed to tell ourselves what we experienced. We have to use these categories. They are the only categories we have ever had. So when we experience the thing in itself surrounding us directly, in non-spatial temporal terms, in non-physical terms, emerging from that experience, we immediately dress it up or tell ourselves what we experienced in spatial temporal terms, in physical terms, because these are the categories we have. And that's, I think, why people often report a quasi-veridical out-of-body experience. I have had one, and I can tell that from experience. Once I was asleep, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and I start walking around my house. Yeah. And it was my house. It's just that there were some peculiarities about it. I thought, that this doesn't belong in my house. What is that? It's strange. It is my house, but at the same time, it's not. And then I woke up. For real. In other words, I was dreaming that I was having a dream.
Yeah.
Then I woke up from the dream, had an out-of-body experience, and then I actually woke up. And then I thought, strange that I would have a dream out-of-body experience in which I actually walked around my house as it is now at this time of the night, because the plants were in a certain place, things were arranged as they actually were at that moment, not 1 week earlier. But at the same time, there were strange peculiarities about it, things that didn't match. So I'm not saying that that particular experience is an instance of the explanation I'm about to give, but it motivated the explanation. And insofar as we can assume that OBEs are real, and I think they probably are, but insofar as we can assume they are real, I think what's happening is that the dissociative boundary sort of weakens. We experience by direct acquaintance some of the mental activity that surrounds our outer. That mental activity is not physical, but it would be perceived as physical if you actually were awake and walking around. It's just that you experience the thing in itself and not its image through the sense organs. But we immediately try to convert that into perceptual categories in order to tell ourselves what happened. And that conversion is not perfect. It's not completely accurate. And that's why the OBEs tend to be as veridical as they are peculiar and non-veridical. There are veridical aspects to it that people seemingly can confirm by going to the place and saying, yes, I saw this and I didn't know this existed, so it was real. But at the same time, there are these peculiarities that don't match. So I think that's the reason. Something is lost in translation because the experience is by acquaintance and not through the intermediation of perception. But we try to fit that into the categories of perception because that's the only internal language we have to tell ourselves what happened. And that conversion, because it's forced and not natural, leads to some mistakes. But this is speculation. Keep in mind, and your audience too, please, the case I put forward for analytic idealism depends on none of these speculations. I just like to speculate freely with somebody who is intelligent. So we are engaging in this now, but please don't judge analytic idealism based on these speculations about its possible implications. The case stands or doesn't, regardless of these speculations that we are entertaining here.
Yeah, sometimes all we can do is speculate. But that's one thing I really liked about your course on the Essentia YouTube channel, where you kind of laid things out logically. And I actually really enjoyed that. During that course, some things clicked for me, especially about the dashboard that just seemingly hadn't clicked before when I was reading books. So I highly recommend that people check that out. Do you think this would be possible? This is the last question before I ask for book recommendations here. Would it be possible, do you think, for a person who, because there are people that claim that they can out-of-body experience, like bang, like Tom Campbell claims that he can do something that many people, it would take them a period of time through meditation to do. He's like, bang, my state changes right now. And I don't know what I think about that, but do you think it would be possible for a scientific experiment to take place where a person was in one room and they meditated and had an out of body and floated on into another room and read a series of numbers and then came back and reported the series of numbers, some kind of scientific proof that would be undeniable? Do you think that in principle could happen, or am I way off here?
I may be naive and prejudicial, but I think if this were possible, exactly in the terms you're describing, the question would have been settled already. We wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah.
So I don't think it is.
Yeah, that would be what I would want to see, you know. I appreciate you stopping by again to talk with me. I have, I guess, one final question. When it comes to studying these issues in the future, like I said, I need to maybe partake in some activities that help me to not depend on those fallacies in my way of thinking as I'm trying to figure things out. What would you recommend to someone who wants to become more familiar with this? And you can throw some book recommendations in there if you want, and I'll give you the final word. I'll cut it when you're done.
Oh, I'm not going to recommend my own books because they are not the ones I used to engage in this journey. They were the product and not the facilitators of the journey. I would, the best I could do is...
Let me actually ask that question because I didn't get it out right. For me, as a layperson, it can be one thing for me to have a conversation with you about your ideas and whatnot. However, it could be a whole different situation if I were actually going to try to give your view of the world to someone else. If I were actually to debate someone with your ideas opposed to materialism or something, that can be a challenge for me. It's one thing to read a book and say, okay, this makes sense to me. It's another thing to be able to kind of defend that kind of position if someone were to want to do that. So what would you recommend? Should someone like explicitly study philosophy in and of itself, or go with one particular book? What would you say to someone that just wants to get better with not only understanding these ideas, but understanding them in such a way that they could have a debate with someone about the issues?
I think prior to even understanding the ideas, one has to find a way to set oneself open to the ideas. Otherwise, you will not be honest to yourself in trying to understand the ideas, because you'll be projecting, you'll be begging the question, you will be convincing yourself of what you already wanted to convince yourself of. And you're not giving yourself a fair play to engage in this activity. It would be a form of self-deception. So to really be open, it's very difficult to truly be open, because we live in a massive global culture that is telling us what has to be true. And all the alternatives are therefore obviously stupid and irrational. That's the mainstream storyline. So first, you have to convince yourself that it is possible that the mainstream is wrong. And not only conceptually, but you have to feel in your body that this is possible. How to do that? Study history. That's what I would recommend. Because at every single juncture in the history of human thought, particularly of Western thought, we have, as a culture, been completely convinced that we had gotten our story right, except for a few details. We have always been quite sure, quite confident that the mainstream storyline about what reality is and what we are was largely correct. And we just had to adjust some details. And every single time, the next generation has proven the previous to be completely and utterly wrong. It is this historical perspective that you need to develop in order to give yourself a fair chance to understand the state of play. What are the hypotheses on the table? Because otherwise you will say to yourself, how could possibly the mainstream be wrong? So many scientists, so many philosophers, so many educational institutions, they can't possibly have gotten it wrong. You know, there is this enormous inertia and momentum going for the mainstream storyline, and you are such a small little intellect, a small little person. How can you be arrogant to the point of defying that huge monster of the mainstream narrative? Who do you think you are? You're nobody. You don't know. How can you think that you can know better? That's what we will be thinking, unless you have a historical perspective and you understand that at every single turn, without fail, that monster of the mainstream was wrong. Every single time. And we have absolutely no reason to think that now it will be different. It certainly will not. Actually, we are already in that phase of transition, because people involved in the publishing world, and I just had a conversation with somebody else more involved in the publishing world than me. I'm not going to cite his name because it doesn't make any sense, but he said the same thing I was already noticing. You cannot find anyone today, anyone serious, that is respected, that has a position, has some skin on the game, something to lose if he makes or she makes a fool of themselves. You cannot find a person willing to engage in a explicit defense of mainstream physicalism today. No, but I mean, there may be exceptions. I wonder if Daniel Stoliar would be an exception to this. But even him is not really a mainstream physicalist. His physicalism is physicalism between scare quotes, if you know what I mean. Nobody is willing to step on a public stage and say, let me defend against the criticisms that you may pose mainstream physicalism to you. It has gone silent. People are not willing to do that anymore. So what physicalism has going for it is the inertia. There is nobody pushing that train anymore. And there is no coal in the furnace of that steam engine. It's going on inertia, but it's a massive train. So if you step in front of it alone and try to stop it, you'll be killed, even though the engine is not working anymore, because it's big inertia. It will take a while. What you can do and should is stand on the side of the rails and observe that the engine is not working. It's still going. It's not going to stop. Don't put yourself in front of it, but from the outside, without risking yourself, Just keep in mind that this is what has always happened. Always. The Vikings truly believed in the pantheon, in the Nordic pantheon, and their direct influence on the turns of life. And they knew they were right. They didn't believe it, they knew. Now, we don't believe in physicalism, right? At least in the 20th century, we knew physicalism was right. Just like the Vikings knew that Odin and Freya and Loki, they were interfering with human affairs. They just knew that. So the story always changes. We think we knew. When Christians knew they were right. When the papacy became powerful at the turn of the second millennium, so from the year 1000 onwards, thereabouts, Europeans knew Christianity was right. They knew it. So much so that the Pope had next to the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope had the highest temporal power. Not only spiritual power, temporal power. No, the Christian faith determined how societies would work, how people would behave, because people knew it was right. Today we know physicalism is right. Well, not quite. The engine had stopped. I predict that by 2050, people will implicitly know that physicalism is not tenable, and there will be a favorite alternative, which I think will be idealism, of course. But develop this historical perspective. Otherwise, the train will run over you. You don't stand in front of the train. Look at the history of trains and how they behaved. And you will know that although this one is moving, it's coming to a halt, as it has always happened. Always. The mainstream, historically speaking, the fact that an idea is mainstream, if you look historically, what does it correlate with? Does it correlate with truth? No, the correlation is precisely the opposite. All the mainstream stories have been proven wrong. So the fact that an idea is mainstream, if anything, indicates that it's untrue. It's the opposite of what you would think if you don't adopt a historical perspective. That's the best I can say.